1, 2, 3, 1, 2.
This is the Fundamental Escape Podcast with Mark Fitzgerald. I'm David Werba, and this is episode 22. The music you just heard is from today's guest, Jennifer Knapp, who's a Grammy-nominated folk rock artist. And the clip you just heard was from her song Martyrs and Thieves, which we will play in its entirety at the end of the podcast. But I can tell you right now, it's awesome. Now, like myself, Jennifer started off as a reticent trumpet hero, which she will explain in a bit here. But she talks with Mark about her journey through the genres of Christian and secular folk rock, and also the shock of becoming a poster child for Jesus just a few years after becoming a Christian. It's a really interesting discussion, so let's get to the podcast with Jennifer Knapp.
Cool. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fundamental Escape Podcast. I'm your host, Mark Fitzgerald, and today I have a very special guest, a musical guest, Jennifer Knapp, who is an artist, a Christian artist that I was very familiar with back in the late 90s, and very happy to have you on the show, Jennifer.
Well, nice to be here, Mark.
Awesome. Cool. So we're just going to dive in. And I've just got some thoughts and questions to throw at you and see how we go. So awesome. As I said, I did grow up on a diet of only Christian music. I grew up in a bit of a bubble, evangelical Christian bubble, I guess you could say.
Wow.
And yeah. So your music was basically, I guess you could say, the soundtrack to my teenage years growing up, I guess is probably a fair way to say it. And so I actually spoke to Reese Roper from Fire and Frenzy on the podcast the other day, and we kind of dived into the whole subject of the whole phenomena of Christian music and what that was all about, and he had some pretty interesting thoughts. And I guess just to kind of start it off, be keen to ask you, like, how did you get started out in music, and what drew you to music? How did you sort of know that was your path, I guess you could say?
Well, I mean, it's kind of a strange story, because the fact that I'm a professional musician in the way that I am right now is a little bit odd. I think a lot of people dream about it, and I didn't particularly have any idea where it's going to end up. I mean, I started playing music in my my teenage years. I was a trumpet player, actually.
Oh, wow.
Originally, yeah. So I really started on the classical bend to kind of shorten the story.
I did not expect that.
Yeah, to shorten the story, I actually ended up going to university as a trumpet player and was on a classical music approach, was probably going to look to conduct or teach in some regard. And somewhere along that way in college, I had the evangelical experience, became a Christian, and as a result of that, somewhere in there, I kind of tinkered around playing guitar a little bit, just mostly kind of in a nerdy way to try and learn a stringed instrument.
Yeah.
And then I started to do some covers of bands that I liked at the time, like Cowboy Junkies and Tracy Chapman, 10,000 Maniacs, things that I was listening to at the time. But kind of part of that evangelical experience was my friends highly encouraging me, like you were talking about that phenomenon in the 1980s or the 1990s where evangelical Christianity was really pushing hard to kind of immerse yourself in all things Christian. So I was really pushed away or encouraged to stop listening to things like the Indigo Girls or 10,000 Maniacs, such secular and evil artists, and was really encouraged to kind of concentrate on faith-based type of approaches. So as a result of that, somewhere in there, one of my friends really started to encourage me to start kind of diving into my Christian experience in the way that I was writing. And I started writing music on my acoustic guitar and started kind of playing with the praise and worship bands around, were around my college and church. And that just really kind of in the course of a couple of years I started writing and performing in the Christian music style. And before I knew it, I had a Christian record deal. I had no idea that Christian music existed in a bubble or
Yeah.
what the
Oh,
genre
it
was like.
definitely
Yeah,
did.
and in a lot of ways, I started creating in that space. And it's funny you mentioned the Five Iron Frenzy kind of guys. They were kind of coming up in the same ilk of artists that I ended up being kind of lumped into with this trend where we kind of had this worldly experience, but we're also wanting to express something really natural and not necessarily churchy about our experience. And I kind of got swept up in that. I think there was a strange kind of phenomenon that happened at the time. And before I knew it, it's, like I had a career and it just kind of took off. And yeah, so it was kind of a really bizarre happening to go from a trumpet player to a pop music musician. But the songwriting really was something that was a sincere experience for me to be able to kind of write about this kind of wild experience of having, this evangelical immersion and what that meant and all of the things that kind of wrapped up in showing up in the lyrics of my songs, just confusion about, what evangelical experience is supposed to mean, trying to balance that over a genuinely positive experience of spiritual expression. And I think that's become like this strange legacy looking backwards.
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess I'd be interested in your take on these sort of things as well. As I talked to Reese about it, was, I sort of shared with him my personal experience growing up. To me, Christian artists were on this other level. I had this. I don't know where this came from. I sort of joked about it with him, but I was like, for whatever reason, I looked at these Christian artists like yourself and others and were like, man, these people are doing this full-time thing for Jesus. They must be so close to God, And it's really bizarre. I guess it comes down to, I guess everybody wants somebody to look up to, right? I suppose that's part of it. But I just wonder your sort of reflections, because your story is obviously a bit different, because obviously we'll get into it a bit later, but, you took a big break from music and whatnot, but being in that sort of Christian bubble, as we say, what are some of the problematic sides to that, or are there any problematic sides to that you see looking back?
Well, in addressing like that kind of sensation you got as a listener, about, I think there was some marketing that went into it in the 90s, that idea, even in just the concept of Christian musicians, right? That there's this ideal, and I think that was part of my discomfort, and that genuinely led to my kind of leaving the genre, is that idea that the people that are performing music about that faith are some way succeeding at creating this, utopic type of
Yeah.
experience, the perfect experience. And I think the strange thing about that is, the musicians that I've particularly liked, whether secular or sacred, are the people that talk about the honest experience that you're actually having in the place and time. And I think that's part of what I think was the success of the faith-based music that I had. I don't think I sugarcoated my experience, but I think that was also one of the incredible positives that you can. And I think groups like Five Iron Frenzy, or I think of Dakota Motor Company, the 77s, Sixpence and the Richer. I mean, these are all groups that I looked at that made it possible for me to even imagine creating in that space.
Yeah.
They were really normal people. And when you meet them in real life, which I actually had the opportunity of kind of coming up through the ranks with these guys, we were all kind of just really incredibly normal people. And, and the strange...
Don't ruin the illusion.
The strange thing is, when the marketing comes out, there was and I don't know if you experienced this in New Zealand, but part of what happened, say in the retail place, was that parents were, at the Christian bookstore were being told, listen, if your kid likes Melissa Etheridge or the Indigo Girls, then don't let them listen to that anymore. Let them listen to Jennifer Knapp. And which is so bizarre, because, and even as as an artist, people would ask me who my influences were, and I would, they were 90% secular artists, and I learned to not talk about that, because when I said that, it was going against the marketing that people were trying to do. And So I think
Yeah.
it's the blessing and the curse. On one side, it's really great thing, I think, to be able to show and express your faithful and your experience, your spiritual experience musically. I think we do that in all forms of music. We express what we're experiencing. But the backside of that is kind of what you were, talking about, where it kind of elevates this idea that you're supposed to achieve something that's largely impossible, or just so beyond the realms of, if you don't succeed at a certain point, then you're failing. And I think that's the part that, for me, ultimately led to a real questioning of what my role was inside of that genre, and a real concern when I would meet people on the street who thought that I was more than I was or more than I could be at the
Yeah.
time. Or
Yeah.
would be disappointed in me in my spiritual journey, which was incredibly important to me, would criticize that, and as a way of, wow, you're not succeeding. You're not what I imagined you to be. And kind of like what you were saying, when somebody would see you being a normal, real human being who perhaps wasn't living up to this majestic idea, that then people would go, oh, well, now your music's nothing.
Yeah.
Usually for me, you're not at all what I bought into, and that's the only reason why I bought you, and why I listened to you. And I think that as a musician, for me, somewhere around the course of that process becomes not a very good trade, And I think what I learned from that, from a spiritual level, is that, inside a faith community, we can talk and we can aspire to being the the best versions, or the holiest versions of ourselves. But there's a really interesting kind of gradient, I suppose, to allowing grace to have happen. I mean, life is a journey and it's long, and to the idea that you're supposed to instantly be able to be in this perfect zone, or this holiest of zones, is really kind of antithetical, I think, to the Christian experience. So it's kind of a fun thing to have to learn. But when you're in your 20s, you just feel the pressure of that, and as you get older, you start going, hey,
Yeah.
mate,
Well, how old were you when you started out in music?
Relatively young-ish. I mean, like I said, I'd been doing music for quite some time before I got onto the Christian music scene. But I was probably in my early 20s when I started touring independently, long before I made like an any kind of national or international level of recording, recognition. But, I retired from the Christian music industry when I was 26 or 27. So I was still relatively young, and
It's an early retirement.
yeah, it was. But at that time, I think it was kind of, a strange experience. And I think even more so, like in terms of Christianity, I'd only been a Christian maybe for 2 or 3 years by the time I was touring heavily and becoming a poster girl for Jesus, so to
Wow,
speak.
yeah, it's interesting. You sort of hinted at that before, and that kind of stuck out to me because, from my perspective as a listener to your music, you just kind of naturally make the assumption that, oh, this person's been a Christian all their life, kind of thing. Like, it's quite interesting to hear you say that.
Well, and I think I think that what's interesting when you look at the timeline of what was happening in the 90s, and kind of the interesting part of it is a lot of the musicians that were like me, that were coming up and were kind of expressing this new experience, were actually relatively new. They weren't Christians that had grown up with Christianity. Like a lot of the artists that had before, most of the artists that you had seen were lifelong, family long. I mean, Christianity was a part of their daily lives. And so I think part of what had happened in the 90s is you were starting to see a lot of people who had cross-cultural experiences that were, that were not necessarily quote unquote new to the church as in babies and didn't have anything to contribute, but rather culturally able to express something about the evangelical experience that we hadn't yet seen in the genre before.
Yeah. I suppose just to dive in a little bit to like your music itself. One of my favorite tracks ever has to be, I'd have to say, is Martyrs and Thieves. And I was curious because a lot of your songs are like very, it's kind of storytelling, right? Like you kind of take us somewhere, and I just love that, and I don't like the idea of sort of deconstructing like a song completely, like line by line or anything like that. But with a song like that, I just sort of wonder, generally speaking, like, where does that come from? Like, where do you find that?
Yeah, I wish I knew where to go at the times where I'm songwriting. I mean, I think it's kind of, Martyrs and Thieves in particular is a song when I really think about writing it, I actually really I intensely remember the experience of when and where that happened. Because that's the way I would describe it. It was something that happened, not necessarily something that I felt like was created. I mean, I was sitting in, I wrote that song long before I had a record contract. I was kind of hashing out my own spiritual experience. I was a newbie in the church and wildly excited about this new life I felt that I had, but also a complete confusion of the guilt and the shame that I felt in walking into a church when everyone expected me to be better than I knew that I could be. And there were a lot of songs on Kansas, which is the record that's from. There were a lot of songs on that express that. And Martyrs and Thieves was just one of those things. I mean, it was almost like a prayer that I sat down and wrote in my own confusion and in my own willingness to be, to be in a place of learning about my faith as much as being willing to be humbled before it and soft. But I think that the challenge of Martyrs and Thieves and again, a lot of the songs on Kansas was this challenge to be the willingness to be renewed but not willing to exchange it for my own sense of personal self and well-being. Like,
yeah,
I don't know if that makes sense. But
no, that's great. I mean, it does. And I think, I actually wrote a little bit of a blog on my website reflecting on that track. And, just throwing out one of the lines to people who may not have heard the song, just that line where it says, there are ghosts from my past who have owned more of my soul than I thought I'd given away. And, and it goes on, obviously, it's just incredible. But, like your music looking back to me really did stand out. And again, I don't want to rubbish other artists at all. That's not what I'm about. But there was this kind of real self-awareness. Do you know what I mean? Like this real kind of, wow, this person's really being on a journey sort of thing.
Well, my therapist always says that I'm annoyingly self-aware.
Your music is incredibly self-aware. And I think I'm a very self-aware person as well. And it annoys the crap out of people. But that's why I think I resonate with it so much, to be honest. So I guess just moving forward a little bit, you talked a little bit on the interview you did with Larry King, about your sort of getting burnt out. You did sort of, I think, was it 2 records back to back and tons of touring and stuff like that, and you just kind of got burned out. And I wonder if that sort of, I don't know how much you want to say about that kind of burnout phase or anything like that, but, part of my podcast, I guess you could say, I consider myself a bit of an evangelical burnout sort of thing, like growing up all my life in the church and things like that, and kind of had to really question everything I believe, and, not even knowing sometimes if I can continue holding on to my faith. And I just wonder if that burnout is almost on 2 levels, where it's like, as an artist, you obviously want to be good and put out music that's great, but at the same time, being in that Christian world, there's that added pressure of like, I'm an ambassador for Jesus as well, like at the same time. And I wonder if those 2 things combined are sort of a perfect storm for a great burnout.
Well, I think I tend to, like, at this point in time, I've been a Christian now for over 20 years. I think one of the things that I was starting to understand earlier in that experience and that I'd probably describe now is that, I tend to think that we live seasonally. I think there's time for great growth. I think there's time for just chilling out and, practicing what you know. And then somewhere in there, you learn that you don't know something and you've got to kind of move on to the next thing. And you kind of have these ebbs and flows of learning and practicing, learning and practicing. And I think the experience that I was having, particularly as a young Christian and then also as a professional Christian, it was always this kind of sense that you're high achieving all of the time. And you're always accomplishing, you're always learning something new, you always have something to say. And, I got to a space where I was like, I don't have anything more to say about this. Like, I have to just chill out. I need to like not have to go to church every single day of every single minute of every single day.
Yeah.
I need a break from obsessing about Jesus. And
Yeah.
which for me at the time was it caused me a lot of guilt. It caused me a lot of anxiety, and it made me feel like I wasn't, the spiritual person that I was supposed to be, because kind of in a kind of a crass way to say it, I kind of stopped giving a shit. Like, I just
Love it.
like, man, I just needed a hot minute to just not have to talk all the time about
Yeah.
and frame everything that I said and thought and did into a spiritual language. In long term, it made me feel disconnected from the rest of my experience. I was fatigued.
Yeah.
And to express that in that environment, I think this is something that for people who've had an evangelical experience kind of run up against too, is when you just kind of need a break to just chill out and quote unquote be normal. There's, at least I had the experience of feeling really guilty, like something was spiritually wrong with me, because I just kind of needed to break off. And it didn't necessarily mean that I wanted to go out bar hopping and have sex with 12 different people every night of the week, which was kind of, I had people in my life that were like, that's what you want to do. If you don't do these things, this is what's going to happen to you.
Yeah.
And, it doesn't. And long story short, when I stepped away from Christian music, I thought that I might be stepping away from my faith, which is what everyone told me that I would happen. And to be honest, I just need to go to the wilderness and be quiet. And if my faith came with me, and if my spiritual experience came with me, and if God could find me wherever I went,
Absolutely.
I kind of challenged that to happen. If this was a real experience, then I didn't need to have to manufacture this every day. And that was part of what I learned. And I think that the comfort level of having gone out of that experience was like, wow, this is my spirituality, my faith is something that goes with me wherever I go. And, it ebbs and flows and has peaks and valleys, and getting comfortable with that and not being guilted or shamed into the space that I'm in is part of, I think, a spiritual maturity that I didn't anticipate. But at this point in time in life, I kind of welcome.
Yeah. And it's funny. I mean, I know for me, like I've been through, and I've shared it on other episodes of my podcast as well, where, I've been through severe burnout myself, like mentally and things like that. And, I was this very zealous black and white, it's this way or that way kind of Christian, and things just collapsed, and I had to really sort of ask myself some serious questions. And it seems to me that there is, as you would know yourself as well, like there is a huge change across the landscape of Christianity over the last number of years, where now we've got things like the emergent church and different writers and authors who are sort of taking things in different directions. And I would say, I got to speak with Brian McLaren. He came to New Zealand earlier this year, and he's been a real sort of person for me that's helped. His writing has sort of helped a lot to sort of create space for me to go, hey, there's some room here where, like you said, other people, I think oftentimes people want to, if you don't know your own story, I think there's plenty of other people that want to tell you what your story is. Like they'll tell you, oh, you're leaving the faith, or this is what's happening. And I think you have to kind of figure that out for yourself. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. And, I think for those of us who've gone the experiences that we're talking about, I think the danger there is to think that, that telling your own story that's a huge thing. I talk about that a lot of times in, LGBT faith advocacy, and I'm sure we'll get to that in a second. But, knowing your own story and knowing your own experience and having confidence in that experience is really important. But I don't think it's necessarily insidious approach of the church I don't think necessarily the church is always trying to tell our own story, or other people around us in our spiritual lives are trying to tell that. I mean, I think if I were to say anything, most of us as human beings are really inclined to see somebody going through an experience and wanting to help. So we tell somebody the way that it is. Oh man, if you're struggling with this, you've got to do this. I mean, this really helped me. I was in Bible studies every day of the week, and I prayed, and you've got to do this, and you've got to do that. And it can transform into, if you don't do those things, then you're not doing it wrong. And then think that happens a lot of times in the church experience. So, but like I said, I don't think it's necessarily an insidious thing. I think it just can be a negative side effect of people wanting to share that experience and how much we verbalize and talk about this in community. The challenge is when you as an individual come up against something in your own story and in your own experience. I mean, we saw this, I think, in the 80s, where there was a real backlash. For example, if somebody got divorced in your church community, you'd kick them out because they weren't having the right. It's an evidence of some bad spiritual experience. And those same people were still having spiritual experiences and went on to other churches that would allow them to help heal and rebuild. So it takes a real community when you're actually struggling with something that's different from the way that a majority of people are talking about. So I'll open the door really wide and say, for me to come out as gay was a huge thing because nobody around me that I had experienced was willing to talk about that, was willing to show that as something that was a legitimate thing that could happen or could be going on for a person of faith. And so, for better or for worse, I think we're coming into a new spiritual age, perhaps in the emergent church, where we're willing to put that out there. Most of us haven't forsaken our faith for the real life challenges that we're facing. And I think that's part of it, being able to talk about the real things that are happening rather than just the ideal of what we hope to pursue.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I have to say I'm quite grateful that you brought up the whole subject of homosexuality because I was kind of edging towards it diplomatically, and I didn't want the whole interview to be about that, to be quite honest with you. But I guess inevitably I do have a few thoughts and questions on the whole thing. It's funny how I came across, I had some friends who somehow, I guess online, found out the whole story that you'd come out and everything like that, and they sort of told me in this kind of way of like, Jennifer Knapp is gay and she's not even like sorry about it kind of thing. And I was like, okay, that's kind of like,
what a shame and what a pity. It's
usually So that was kind of, that's how the story was kind of put to me. And I was like, okay. And then I went online and someone had uploaded the Larry King episode and things like that. And so I watched that. And my first reaction was like, good. Like, finally there's a voice. I had this, I don't know if it was like a rebellious thing. I have no idea to my like Christian background and growing up and things like that. But I was like, I just had this real sense of like, finally there's a sensible voice on the table discussing this subject, right? And I guess going back to what I was saying before about other people telling a story. I mean, there was the guy they had on, the pastor that came on and sort of tried to implore you, like, come back to the faith, Jennifer, and all this kind of stuff.
Right.
That's kind of what I mean when I said earlier, like, people trying to tell your story. Like, he's basically painting this world where you've gone away and you need to come back, And I was just like, what a great way to not listen to someone. Like, like, I was just like, I have to commend you on, like, your, like, composure in that interview, in that situation, because I was just like, this guy is unbelievable.
Well, I think the interesting thing about that is that, I've had this experience before, strangely enough. Like maybe this is the advantage for having not grown up in the church. I don't know. When I first became a Christian, I was 18 or 19 years old. I had a cultural experience with Christianity as most Americans do. I mean, we go to church at least on Easter or Christmas. If you're from the Midwest anyway, you kind of do. So you have a familiarity with it. But in terms of the evangelical immersion, you live your life for Jesus kind of thing, that didn't happen for me until I was 18 or 19. And by that time, I had a pretty long list of sins, quote unquote, that goes from my past, quote,
Right, yeah.
I was among the young women that I was around. I was the only one who had a very long list of sexual experiences. I was a drunk. I cursed. I swore. I smoked. I mean, all of the random vices of hedonism I had, and compared to the girls around me, I felt just like I looked at them. I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm a piece of crap. I can't measure up to these girls. I know things,
Yeah.
And I felt really dirty, and part of the evangelical experience made me feel dirty, as opposed to just going, hey, like, all right, I had to find my pride in that. And it's a long way to say that I fought that, and I learned through that experience that I didn't have to exchange my self-esteem or my honor of myself by acknowledging that I could still pursue a course of holiness or a spiritual experience. I didn't have to kind of black and white treat myself as a good person or a bad person, but these were the experiences that I had. So after I came out, that was kind of the same thing, kind of the same type of experience where, my spirituality had always been what it had been. My pursuit of faith hadn't necessarily changed, because I knew this thing about myself now that, that I was attracted to women more than men. And so what did this mean? These are all questions that I would ask myself privately and in my own time, without being on public display. Well, what does this mean about my faith? Does this mean that I don't love God anymore? Well, of course I love God. I'm still pursuing that. It hasn't instantly changed or created this sense of evil in me. So what does that mean? And so kind of going through that process again for the second time, but with a different subject, was a little bit easier, strangely enough, personally. It's a whole other thing to do that on a public landscape, obviously, but to kind of have that in my back pocket and kind of having worked through that experience, I didn't have such a hard time of battling the shame factor when somebody would, tell me that I was shameful for being gay. I'd kind of already worked through that, and I had my confidence in my faith and in the redemption that I'd already felt like I'd experienced, and I wasn't willing to exchange that. And
in that interview, I have to say, like, you definitely came across as someone who was very comfortable in your own skin, right? Like, you didn't come across as this person trying to, like, justify yourself or prove yourself, and it was interesting to me, the whole premise of the show was, can you be Christian and gay?
It's always so funny to me.
I think that's so absurd. That whole question is just incredibly absurd to me. Like, and again, like, to me, that just, like, to even ask that question shows a complete lack of understanding in the grace of God in general. Like, what do we? I mean, where do you stop with that, those kind of reasonings? Like, if that's the question you're going to start with, I mean, where do you kind of stop with it?
And that's the idea. Like, okay, let's just. For me, it's just like, okay, well, is Christianity, and this is a question I continue to ask myself. I don't necessarily have an answer, but is Christianity a club that I'm in? Like, do I have to do a certain amount of things on the list to keep up my membership? Or is Christianity an experience? And getting to know and building a relationship with God and having a spiritual life is, and maybe that to me is kind of the questions that I've had. And I feel, and I've always felt more comfortable with the idea that Christianity is an experience, that I've gotten to know. If you look evangelically at, you're a Christian now because of the phrase, you've accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, right? While I feel uncomfortable with that language today, but the value of that is saying, listen, I've got a paradigm shift, a radical paradigm shift in my life. I think about kindness and grace and compassion and forgiveness. The type of person I can be in humanity to be a better person in the world and hopefully create a spiritual connection and love and compassion and make the world a better place, for lack of a better way to say it. I'm not going to go back on that. And the source of where I get that inspiration from is largely a Christian source. I want to model and emulate as much as I can the example that Christ had. Now, some people take that on as a religious experience, and that's what religion is. You show up to church, you do these particular things, and I don't think that's necessarily bad. But my experience somewhere in there is like, this is a lifelong experience. It's not just checking off the boxes, because there are some boxes I'm going to argue with and fight with and not understand, and maybe don't even want. The challenge for me in that is to go, okay, well, why is that there? I don't want to necessarily say that I don't want to do it, but I want to understand it. And I don't want to just do something or be something for the sake of having just, acted it out because somebody told me to do it, but rather to know it and have it actually be something that's a full part of my life that I've adopted and is as much a part of my being that I want to do is take my next breath. And I think that's sometimes a challenge we see when we ask questions like, can you be gay and Christian, or
Yeah.
can you be a Republican, or can you be a Democrat and be Christian? Can you be pro-female, um, you know, pro-female, rights, there's all kinds of things that people, you can fill in the blanks so that people get an idea of what a Christian should look like. But the fact of the matter is there are Christians in prison. There are Christians
Yeah.
in, Tibetan monasteries. I mean, who knows? Like all of, anywhere, anything that you can imagine that you could possibly say that, no, they can't be. There is somebody there who's still striving to know God.
Yeah. And I think
yeah.
that was, that was the sort of impulse, like I said earlier, that when I first watched that interview, I was like, I just had this, it's hard to even describe the feeling. I was just like, like, it was almost like, sticking it to the man, like, finally, like, there's someone here, like, who can be in this position. And I'm curious to ask as well, like, since you did sort of come out in such a public way, like, what has been, I guess, both positive and negative, some of the general kind of responses to that?
Well, I think the most positive thing was that I really did not actually anticipate the amount of positive response of coming out. I truly anticipated a complete and utter blackout. In some ways, I kind of wanted that. And in some ways, I kind of anticipated and welcomed, okay, great, I don't have to talk to Christians anymore. I can just go and do my thing.
That sounds amazing.
I can just get rid of all the Christian crazy and all the things because no one in that world's ever going to talk to me again. And great, finally, I'll be left alone. I can do my own thing. It didn't happen that way. I think the positive thing was, I think my sexual orientation has been my fill in the blank for a lot of frustrations that a lot of Christians have felt over the last 20 years of going, what about me, fill in the blank, has made people think that I'm not serious about my faith or not as good at my faith as they think I should be. And the positive part of that was that I found a lot of people that were just going, hey man, keep going. Like, this is a positive thing in your life and we support you. And I think in terms of a larger scope of just some of the demonization that a lot of LGBTs have experienced, particularly in American culture from religious community, to have somebody not break down and to keep going, I think was a real positive thing. And for me to come out, part of that for me was, after coming out and I'm going out and playing shows and I'm still nervous. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I had shaky knees a lot going, oh my gosh, like all I'm going to hear about is the gay thing all night long.
Yeah.
People, are looking at me half cross-eyed half the time. Yeah. But in going out and playing shows, I met other people who were having the same experience and that were, just really encouraging and sharing their experiences with me. And that made me feel a little bit better just to be able to connect. So that was hugely positive. I don't know if I have a negative thing to add to the coming out experience necessarily. I mean, and I'm a pessimist, for me to sit here and go, I don't know, I can't really find the thing that I really hate or am uncomfortable about. I mean, I think that maybe in the gray area is just the fact that as a person, as an individual, I think there is a moment where I take the weight of having been one of those people. I mean, I'm not the first gay person to come out inside of Christian community. This has been happening again and again, but I think for the fact that I've, had a lot of press about it and been given the opportunity to talk about it, I do have concern about anybody having an experience somewhere running up against that they think that this is a huge paradigm shift that will, potentially threaten their own spiritual experience. Either or. I mean, I don't, for some people who don't see homosexuality, quote unquote, as being compatible with Christianity, it's a real test for them. And I think my concern is for those kinds of folks to feel like they're demonized as equally. I think we're all on a journey, and I think that's a challenge somewhere in here for all of us who, anytime we have a theological difference between one another, that we kind of move away from a theological war and an ownership of Christianity, and that's a real challenge for me.
Yeah.
Is I don't want to be that guy
Yeah.
who's saying that the other Christians are wrong, because that's not my point. The point is that we're all on a journey that we need to be able to figure out how to share together.
Yeah, I suppose just on a practical level, potentially on the negative, was there any like ramifications in relation to the sales of your music? Like, were there stores that kind of pulled records off the shelves and stuff like that, or did that happen? Or
Yeah, pretty much. I'm the sole distributor of all my Christian back catalog now.
it's like, here, have it.
Yeah, I mean, there are Christian retailers that, I mean, they haven't necessarily stopped selling them. I mean, it's kind of a tricky slope, because on one hand, like, there's no reason to stack my records in a Christian music bookstore, because it's been 10, 15 years since I did my last record. So you just don't stock those kinds of records that are that year, but you still have access to them. If you want to buy it or you want to go order it. And so, some stores will still sell it, but they don't really advertise that they sell me. I will say that a lot of times as a recording artist, whenever you come out with a new record, any artist, you usually have a bump in sales in your back catalog. Because, everybody's, Jen Knapp's got a new record out. And, oh, yeah, I really like that record from, 2001. I'll go buy that too again, or whatever. You see that kind of thing. And my sales compared to other people's is not quite as high. It's a combination of, the secular music that I'm doing down and the mainstream music I'm doing now. People aren't that inclined to go back and buy a faith-based catalog. And it's also pretty hard you have to kind of go out of your way to find my old stuff. So it has been affected in some ways compared to other artists, but it's also a little bit hard to tell. The economy is just a totally new one. So I don't really want to bash it, but there's no doubt that there are refusals of faith-based people, faith-based, retailers and media who are just absolutely refuse to talk about me.
Yeah.
And for example, I did a book called Facing the Music that I released last year, and Christian retailers, even though it's talking about somebody that's very familiar to their audience, they won't.
That's interesting.
Or push the book.
It's funny. I remember Rob Bell mentioning a story about how he ended up going to this Christian bookstore. Someone told him a story of how they went to a bookstore to ask for his books, and the guy was like, "Yeah, we do have them, but." They were behind the counter and they were in brown paper bags.
Yeah, and that's, I've heard stories. I don't know this for a fact because I don't go into Christian bookstores and try and buy my own stuff. But I've had other people say that's basically the way my products get treated, is they'll sell it and they'll make money off of it, but they won't advertise it and they don't want to tell anybody. So it's kind of this, I think if I had any comment to make about it, it's the strange hypocrisy about that type of thing where if you don't want to sell it, then don't sell it. That's the only thing I've ever said is like, listen, if you're not going to put me on your shelves because of any issues with sexual orientation, then don't sell me at all. Like, just don't do it. Like, why would you take the money?
Yeah, I guess you could they could compartmentalize. They could be like, well, this was her Christian stuff and this is her not Christian stuff. Like put it into categories. But I guess just in sort of winding down, I watched your the TED talk that you did. You did some music and a bit of speaking and things, and I was keen to sort of jump into the kind of points you reflected on. You sort of talked about the three different points that you sort of wound up with. Was the first one you talked about how it's difficult for prejudice to survive proximity. And I thought that was quite interesting. And again, like, I'm so keen with these conversations that I'm having to talk to, I was actually jokingly saying to someone yesterday, if you got all the people I've spoken to over the last 6 months in a room together, it would be a very, very interesting interaction because they don't see eye to eye on everything. It would just be a very funny thing. But yeah, I thought that was quite interesting. to sort of say. And then you did quote, was it Martin Luther King? He says, our lives begin to end the day we are silent about the things that matter. And I thought it was interesting, and it made me think because I spoke with Jay Baker earlier this year, and there's a clip on YouTube of him coming out in advocacy for gay marriage, and this was a number of years ago when it wasn't sort of done at all. Yeah, and that was quite an impact on me. And he actually quotes Martin Luther King as well, who basically says, "It is not the cries of our enemies that we remember, but the silence of our friends." And then he's sort of like choking up, and he says, I won't be silent for my friends anymore. And I sort of wonder, and again, I kind of want to play devil's advocate a little bit, because you do sort of tie up that TED Talk by reflecting on this sort of question. You sort of say that you wonder to yourself sometimes, well, like, what is there more to say about the LGBT kind of issue? Like, what more can we say? And I sort of wonder, from someone who grew up in a world that was pretty much like oblivious to the whole world of it at all, like it just wasn't an issue in the sense that we didn't even know about it really. And again, I reflected with Brian McLaren about this as well, that a lot of these people who are sitting in churches who, the world are tending to label as bigots or angry or, anti-gay marriage, that they're hateful and things like that. I'm just like, well, that's not the truth. They're just like in this world where that's what they've been handed, And I think there needs to be this kind of space created. Like, yes, I'm no doubt, like, let me be clear, there are bigots in the world. I'm not being that optimistic. But I think there does need to be some space created for the conversation to sort of give space for people to kind of figure it out. You know what I mean?
Brian McLaren, he has a phrase that I actually really appreciate. He talks a lot about the inheritance of what we've learned spiritually inside our faith communities. That we come into it and we're taught, and we, whether it's purposed or just cultural absorption, we inherit that. And sometimes the things that we inherit, later on down the line are things that we realize we don't really need or want. And,
yep.
And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think there's a real tendency to kind of demonize, well, you left me with this crap and now I've got to deal with it and it's all your fault. And I don't have time for that. I'm going, all right, well, that doesn't really, I inherited, when I stepped into evangelical Christianity, nobody was gay and you weren't allowed to be gay, for an example. And it just didn't quite sit right with me because I met people that were gay all the time or kids that would come up to me at shows and tell me, their experiences. And I'm like, well, man, okay, that's cool. I don't really know how that plays in the theological rules, but man, that's cool. And this is long before me and a late bloomer, I realized this was going to kind of hit me, as well. But I think the challenge of that is somewhere in between where, Brian McLaren was talking about what we've inherited and I think in that I try to examine not just what I inherit, but who I am, as a person, be willing to examine that and be willing to be graceful and forgiving in that process as well. And, kind of tying in the Martin Luther King kind of thoughts of silence. And I think the trend that we're experiencing in the, if you want to call it the emergent church movement right now, is that we're willing to talk about more of these things. And the challenge in all of that is in those safe spaces is to create kind of the safety, I suppose, of being able to say, well, these are the experiences I'm having. Please don't demonize me or put me out because this is the experience I'm having. I may have to relearn something. I may not understand it. Like you said, there are people that are going to come out of what they've inherited and want to hold on to a very, quote unquote, bigoted approach to sexual orientation and gender identity. That may work for them. And the challenges for me is if that's what works for them is to still figure out how I am going to be graceful to that, and how I'm going to communicate that when that perhaps maybe affects me negatively. So the silence is a big deal. And, I've had that experience in my own life. There are people that I really wish would stand up and just support me in public that don't support me in public, that support me in private, and it hurts.
Yeah.
But part of that is, us breaking that silence and being talking about it. And I'm somewhere in the middle. I'm not a hardliner. I'm not necessarily out on the streets. I I've never fancied the, kind of going out on a big pride parade with tidy whities. We're here, we're queer, get used to it. I think we're moving away to a little bit more reasonable type of
Well,
kind
that's
of conversation
yeah,
and not having to bust through the wall as hard as we used
yeah,
to and being able to
and
propagate genuine conversations.
yeah, and I think tying it back together, back to the interview with Larry King as well, like, I think that's what I appreciated the most about your approach in that conversation, because, you were this reasoned, sound-minded person just talking the way you were talking about the issue. And, I thought that was refreshing for one and needed, and very needed. And yeah, I guess just to sort of close things out, I was keen to ask as well, just in closing, like, compared to sort of, I guess the music that you put out before your big break and, coming back into it now, there does seem to be a little bit of a distinction. Like, I love all the music, to be clear. I'm a fan, unashamedly. But there is sort of, to me, there comes across some sort of clear distinctions, and, like, your latest sort of music does come across more human, more relaxed, like more like this person's been on a real kind of journey even more, and, like, kind of just very human, if I can say it that way.
Yeah, well, I think somewhere in there, it's the idea of getting comfortable with what you've got. I don't know if you've ever read any Peter Gomes, but Peter Gomes is relatively famous for saying, "I am what I am, and I've got what I've got." And I think if there's anything that I've kind of tried to relax into more through the recent years, is just to be honest with what I've got, and to not feel like I have to buy into the pressure of becoming something that I'm not, or to be something, to create myself to be something that's not honest with the journey that I'm on. And I think it's reflected in a lot of the music that I've tried to do. Is like, listen, there's a time for growth, and there's also a time for trying to just, it's kind of weird, because coming from an evangelical background, I sometimes feel like the criticism of this kind of thought is that you're just being lazy and you don't want to grow, or you don't want to be a better version of yourself. But it's not quite that. It's just saying, listen, I'm really comfortable in my own skin. I'm really comfortable with my own journey, and I'm going to be okay with that. But it doesn't mean that I don't aspire to be more holy, to be more kind, to be more generous. But it means that, there's a good amount of grace. It says, well, I'm doing the best that I can, and I'm going to continue to have pride in the person I am, and know that I'm a person of value, know that I'm a person of worth, that can, maybe if I wasn't the best version of that today, that I still hope that I can be better at that tomorrow, and not just totally write me off. So yeah. I think that's kind of reflected in the music that I've been doing, and just kind of going on and living, and not necessarily shutting down the shop because you have criticism coming behind it. You still got to do the work, and you still got to kind of aspire to do it, and dream a little.
Yeah, I think that's a really awesome place to land the conversation, because I was just, thinking, and what you just said there about people thinking you're sort of lazy in your approach and things, I think that sort of resonates with me as well, where I sort of had to step away from everything, and people kind of sometimes can conclude that, oh, you're just, you're done, you're just going against your faith. And it's like, no, I had to step away because I want to be more faithful, not less. It sounds weird to say it like that, but
yeah, it does.
Like, and you just have to get the hell away from it to go, what am I about? What do I believe? When you sort of have grown up in this world where you've been told what to believe, and you've been handed all these ideas, you go, what is valuable to me? What's left when it's all stripped away, sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, I think somewhere in there, like I love Henry Nouwen's book, Reaching Out. He talks about the difference between loneliness and solitude. It's a great, easy read. But the other part of that too, through that experience, is the observable Christian faith. I think sometimes in that we value a lot, especially in Christian circles, that you have to be observed doing your faith, and if no one can see you, then you're up to no good.
Yeah.
And the reality is that sometimes you have to go into your own private space, and you have to be able to have that experience privately, and let it grow and let it take root, so nobody else can uproot it. And I think that somewhere in there for me has been part of that experience and journey that's been the most valuable, even though the whole time everybody's saying, get out here, we've got to see you, we don't trust you. and I think that's a real risk I felt like that I've had to take, and that we can take with our spiritual experience, to not necessarily have to buy into that the observed faith is the only faith.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a great place to wind up. Well, thanks so much, Jennifer. It's been amazing to have you on the podcast. And yeah, what's next for you? Like, are you doing some touring at the moment, or recording, or what's happening?
Oh, yeah, thanks for reminding me. Well, I just got finished up with touring this fall, so I'm on a bit of a break until the spring. I'll be touring the States again from March through the spring of 2016. Right now, I've just got to start thinking about doing some new writing and thinking about doing a new record. So no pressure.
Cool. Stay tuned. Awesome. We'll just leave it there.
Darkness that I used to cling to, it presses harsh hope against time. In the absence of martyrs, there's the presence of thieves who only want to rob you blind. They steal away any sense of peace. Though I'm a king on my knees, and I know they are wrong when they say I'm strong as the darkness covers me. So turn on the light and reveal all the glory. I am not afraid to bear all my weakness, knowing in meekness I have a kingdom to gain, where there is peace and love in the light. Oh, I am not afraid to let your light shine bright in my life, in my life. Oh, there are ghosts from my past roam over my soul, and I thought I had given away. They linger in closets and under my bed, and in pictures less